Hello, and welcome to the new year. Uh, Gilded Age and Minority Rage. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, ME We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is January 5th, 2021. And on this date in history, in 1838, uh, the telegraph was invented by Samuel Morse. So, uh, do 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 do. Yeah, and everyone knows what that means. So everyone have a great day and a great year. Here we go. Hey, sports fans! We're going to start off today with a little bit of Abraham Lincoln. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't he dead? Oh yes, he's been dead for about 150, almost 156 years. And you're like, wait, no. I mean, isn't he dead in the course right now? That is also accurate. He has been dead since I don't know, the middle of December. But the truth is, I'm starting here kind of to talk about westward expansion, the growth of industrialization, kind of the taming of the West. And by taming of the West, I mean basically the stealing of the West from Native Americans and subjugation of the land, and then also the expansion uh, into the Pacific. Okay, Hawaii, uh, Guam, the Philippines, uh, Samoan Islands. All of this is going to happen during this unit. So, basically, what happens is the Pacific Railway Act helps pay for the railroads to build the railroads across the United States. And you should be asking yourself, why on earth would the United States be doing this? How do they benefit from building the railroad? And really, the railroad was built for the exact same reason that the federal highway system was put together. And it's not for trade, it's not for transportation, but it's for military defense. Okay, getting supplies from one side of the country over to the next. Okay, so if you go back to around 1830, it would take you around 12 months to 18 months to cross from New York all the way to San Francisco. Okay, and part of that was a lack of roads. Part of that was you had to bring enough supplies to last you the entire time. It's not like you can stop and get things at any outpost. And if you did, then you had to have money for that. So once they build the railroad, you can get across the nation in about 4 to 5 days. Then, if you had a car and you were trying to get it across the United States, uh, Eisenhower does that in 1920 whenever he's part of the Army, and it takes him 51 days to get from San Francisco to New York. And that's before the highway system. So once he becomes president in the 1950s, he has a highway built across the United States. And a lot of that's for transport. Also, it makes good landing fields. I don't know if you noticed, but most highways are wide enough so a plane could land on any one of the highways anywhere. So that's the reason that they're building these. Now, to inspire companies to build these these railroads across, they would give them land grants. So for every mile of land that, I'm sorry, for every mile of railroad track that you built, you got 5 square miles of land. So in the bottom chart there, that kind of shows you kind of the land grid around. And so the blue areas are what went to the railroad, the yellow areas are what was controlled by the U.S. government. And so basically, for building a mile of railroad track, you got 5 square miles of land. And if you built 1,000 miles of railroad track, you got 5,000 square miles of land. And the U.S. understood, or Congress understood, that the land near the railroad tracks was very valuable, so they wanted to own an equal amount of the land. Okay, making them very wealthy. Okay, from that they would break the land up and sell it about $3 an acre. So that means that there's 640 acres in a square mile. So that means that that's a total of about $2,000 per square mile, and times 5, that's about $10,000. Now you have to understand this isn't money back then, so you're looking at somewhere close to $1 million right now for each mile of railroad track that you built. And that doesn't even count some of the other things, okay, that you could do where it was closer to the city. You could get more money for it, but on average you could get about $3 for any acre. How close the railroad was to a town would really have an important impact on the survival of that town. And so many towns would bribe the railroad to build the railroad through their town as they're going to the coast. And well, anyway, it was a big way of making yourself really wealthy. Okay. Okay, so the Transcontinental Railroad, this is built mainly by two companies. That's Union Pacific and Central Pacific. Central Pacific built from the west coast towards the towards the east coast, and they'll build as fast as they can to try and get the land there. And Union Pacific is going to build from the central all the way as close to the Pacific as they could. They were mainly built by Chinese and Irish immigrants. Central Pacific employed Chinese immigrants, and the Chinese immigrants went from China to California, and that's where they came from. The Irish immigrants just wandered over where there were jobs, and well, anyway, these two groups built the railroad. They end up meeting in Promontory Point, Utah. Now, they were building so fast they actually passed each other by about 10 miles. And they found out that they were about 30 miles apart, so rather than either side giving up land, they ended up curving back around and meeting in the middle. So it was finished in May of 1869. On the right-hand side, you will see Ulysses S. Grant standing, shaking the hand of I'm not sure who. And he drove the final stake in. It was a stake made out of gold. And as soon as they were done with the ceremony, they took the stake up. So don't think you can go to Promontory Point, Utah, and steal the stake. That's just not how that works. But this made it so that instead of it taking 12 to 18 months to get across the nation, you could now cross in about 4 days. Henry Comstock, okay, his silver and gold mine in Virginia City, Nevada, was called the Comstock Lode. Okay, they found a deposit of gold and silver, and they'll produce a ridiculous amount of gold and silver, about $340 million. In today's money, you're looking at about $10 to $15 billion. So it's a fair amount of money. Now, prostitution. This is one of my favorite slides ever. As you can see there, it is pictured on the left-hand side. Oh, wait, it's not pictured. I don't know. Just the thought of not pictured makes me happy. Anyway, this is the most common employment for women in the West. The West really was a wild place, and for about the first 15 to 20 years, there were not a lot of families out in the West. The first men were really brought over by the gold rushes in California, the gold rushes in Nevada. So there was a lot of gold that brought people over. Now, saloons were one of the biggest businesses out in the West. There were more saloons than there were churches and grocery stores. You could go and get some free food and also hang out with your friends. And you, of course, would have to pay for your drinks. But this is a place where everyone kind of came together, and you spent a lot of money on drinks and entertainment. A lot of these had gambling as well. Okay, so let's talk about Native Americans for a minute. On the left-hand side, what you see are a large number of battles between Native Americans and the U.S. Army, really over about a 40-year span. And of all the battles over on the left-hand side, the only one that was won by the Native Americans was the Battle of Little Bighorn. Other than that, it was several attempts at just violent and ridiculous massacres and battles that were really massacres where, well, we'll get into some of those. In fact, we'll talk about one later on this unit that really gets blown out of proportion. That's the Battle of Wounded Knee, where about 350 to 500 unarmed Native Americans were killed, and they gave out several congressional medals of honor for people that served there. Okay, so in the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, the U.S. is going to guarantee the Lakota Sioux southern South Dakota. Okay, so they're promised this land. The problem is later on people will find gold on it, and that will cause more problems. The Indian Peace Commission. They create two very large reservations on the plains. Now, once you put people on I don't know why I keep almost saying plantations, but once you put someone on a reservation, you then become responsible for them. You know, bringing them food, bringing them whatever supplies they need. That becomes your responsibility. Okay? So who is in charge of this? It would be the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They run the reservations, and the Army is responsible for groups that didn't report. They were given a certain budget to be able to feed all these people. So many dollars per head. Now the problem would be, you know, if they had that kind of budget, what happens to the money that's left over? And they would normally pocket that, so this causes a lot of reservations to be woefully underfunded. So the Sand Creek Massacre, okay, what had happened was the Cheyenne Indians had started attacking wagon trains and ranches in Colorado, mainly because the reservation that they were kind of forced onto did not give them enough food, so they were forced to raid other groups to get the food they needed. So they decided to invite Chief Black Kettle and several of the chief leaders, the leaders and chiefs of the Cheyenne, together to have a peace treaty. They were told, bring your families, this is going to be a great celebration. So they get to Fort Lyon, they close the doors, and as soon as they close the doors, the Army pulls out their gun and starts massacring the Cheyenne. Over 400 of the Cheyenne were killed in the Sand Creek Massacre. So the Great Plains, you can actually see that in the bottom picture there. That's most of the area of the Great Plains. It's a plain, so that means that there's not a lot of trees. A lot of people built their homes out of sod and cow pies. So basically cow crap and dirt is what they made their homes out of. And this would give them protection from the element. They were also referred to as sod busters. There was only 20 inches of rain a year, which is not a lot of rain. It's not quite a desert, but it's not a lot of rain. So how do you get people to move out to that part of the country? Well, this is whenever the Homestead Act comes into play. Okay, so you could offer someone 160 acres if they lived there for 5 years. Sometimes there was a fee of $10 for this, a recording fee. Sometimes it was $5. Depends on which state and region that you were going into. Normally, by the time someone moved there, it was normally in it was the best land was already taken by the time they did that. But depending on how you played your cards, you might be able to turn 160 acres into 4 plots, so 640 acres or a square mile. The wheat belt was another thing that was used to refer to this area of the country. This is a crop that would withstand drought. You could plant it deep in the ground for moisture. So it was really the most important crop of the region. So this becomes what's known as the wheat belt. Now, it didn't take long for businesses to find their way into farming. So they formed what were called bonanza farms. And bonanza farms were a corporately owned farm that sometimes would have up to 50,000 acres. So this would make it harder for the farmers to compete. Ranching. So ranching, this was one of the most important industries in Texas at the time. And this really grows because of open range. Open range is a bunch of land where cattle could go and graze for free. So you could own a large number of cattle, not have to have any land yourself. You just need to have access to some grass for the cows to eat and a nearby water supply. So the U.S. owned the land and just let people move and rove around. Now, the truth is, in South Texas, they have a ranch called the King Ranch, and it's so big, it's bigger than, I want to say, 14 states. So there's 14 states that are smaller than King Ranch, and it will extend all the way down into Mexico. Okay? And again, this land, well, not the King Ranch, but the land that's used for the grasslands is owned by the U.S., and there's no charge to let your cattle graze there. Okay? Cattle, because they had so many cattle and were afraid of people going over to steal them, they would actually brand them with special different symbols. It could be an A, it could be an E, it could be a circle J, just depended on what you were, who you were and what you wanted to put on there. Okay? And cowboys were the main people that took care of the cows. This has been something that's been highly misrepresented in Hollywood, because if you look in Hollywood, all the cowboys out in the West are all white men. Okay? And there were white men, but the majority of them were Confederates. You also had a lot of Hispanic and African Americans serving as cowboys as well. So, whatever stereotypes you think you've seen or heard of where there's a bunch of shootouts in the West, the truth is that was more romanticized to get people to move out to a land where, there's very little waterfall, mainly deserts. So, you make people think that there's adventure, something better out. Now, the cows didn't have a lot of value where there were people with a lot of cows, so they decided to move them. And so if you took them up to the Kansas Railroad, or if you could get them up to Illinois, to Chicago, that's where they butchered most of them and they cut them into steaks. Well, if you're in the South, to really make money off it, you're going to have to transport them all the way up to Kansas. Okay, so this would be sometimes a 4 to 6 month trip where you're getting cows from South Texas all the way up to Kansas. You can go about 5 to 8 miles a day with the entire group if you're really moving. But in truth, it's much, much slower than that, and you're talking about several hundred miles crossing several different rivers on your way up there. Okay? The most famous of these routes was called the Chisholm Trail, but you also have the Shawnee Trail, Western Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, and then a lot of other small ones along the way. Okay? If you sold your cow in Kansas instead of Texas, you generally made an extra 90%. Okay? So you could sell it for a small amount in Texas, or if you took it all the way up to Kansas, you could take even more. And they would then sell the cows mainly by weight. So a lot of people would take and feed their cows a bunch of salt right before they go to the market and let them drink water, so then that would increase their body weight. On the right-hand side, you see Joseph Glidden, who invented barbed wire, and this is going to be what ends the cattle drive. So, before that it was it was not very difficult to go through someone's land, but you might destroy all their crops, and that made people angry. So once they put barbed wire into place, you couldn't just sneak them across someone else's property. So, anyway. Okay, so I kind of touched on this just briefly a minute ago. 25% of Texas cowboys were African Americans. This is actually one of the worst group of charts I've ever seen in my life. I actually did email Michael Siegel and say, what the crap? Why don't you make all the charts, have the same scale on the side of them? Because if you look at it, some of these, like Texas, have 400,000, 200,000, while you go to places like Kansas that have 200 to 100 people. It just does not make a lot of sense, okay? So it's kind of idiotic the way they put these charts on, but the main thing they're trying to do is show how African Americans are moving west, but some of these charts are just, they don't give you any decent information. You know, like the one in Idaho, okay, Wyoming, you know. When you look at Wyoming, you compare it to Texas, where you see, oh wait, the 1870s, you have, what, 250,000 African Americans moving to Texas, and by, 1890, you've got nearly 500,000 African Americans moving into Texas. Okay, so, just a bunch of horrible charts the way they put it together. Be offended, because I am. Okay, the Gilded Age. This unit is called the Gilded Age and Imperialism. And the whole reason that it's called those two things is you have a time period. Well, the Gilded Age is called that because there was a book written at the time called The Gilded Age. And it's written by Mark Twain and Charles Warner. And it talks about how on the surface everything looks like it's in great shape, that it's amazing. But in reality, there's a bunch of really poor people, and there's a bunch of struggles within the nation. Okay, the top 10% of wage earners in the United States at that time earned 75% of all the wages in the nation. Okay, the political parties were basically mirror images of each other, and there was no major difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. Okay, remember, this is years after the Civil War, so a lot of the differences that they had kind of disappeared. So another reason that they called this the Gilded Age, where everything looks good but it's not, is, kind of like anything you've ever gotten that's gilded. Have you ever gotten one of those coins and you're like, oh wow, that's cool, and you go to eat it and it tastes like crap? Or you get one of those necklaces, you see someone who has, a chain around their neck that's, big enough to pull an airplane, and they're like, no, this is real gold, it just weighs like, 20 pounds, and, so-and-so bought me this, like $70,000 necklace. The truth is, most of the time they're painted, and they're going to cause major problems for whoever wears them. So, anyway, happy. Okay, the Bloody Shirt Campaign. Okay, this was used by a lot of people who served in the military in the Civil War, and they would come out and say, hey, I was shot and I was wounded, and I need you to vote for me to be your next, person who figures out the taxes that we were just talking about just a minute ago. Okay? Yeah, I don't know. I panicked on that. Okay? So you might say something along the lines of, hi, my name's Jedediah, and during the Civil War, I went and fought and served this community by trying to do the Lord's work. And during that war, I was shot. And I continued to fight. I went and I recovered, and then I went back to fight again. And so, in the same way that I served you in your city in this last battle of the Civil War, I will do the same thing for you in Congress. So I need you to support me this year. Okay? That's one of the ways they did this. Now, something else is going on, and over on the right-hand side, you see Seymour and Blair, and then you see, to the left of that, the Confederate States of America. Okay? The truth was there was no major difference between the Democratic Party of the time and the KKK. Okay? As demonstrated by the hats, the Confederate States of America, and the KKK holding up the Selma and Blair hat. Or Selma and Blair. Anyway, they're both holding up stuff. So anyway, it's saying that really all that's happened, there's no major changes. So the election of 1868. Now, if you remember Andrew Johnson, he was shamed. They tried to impeach him. He broke the Tenure of Office Act, which was only passed to set a trap so they could get him removed from office. Okay? The currency was falling apart. The nation was trying to recover from the war. And so greenbacks and currency were the main issue. Okay? And African Americans are actually going to vote with the help of the U.S. Army. Now, is this because the Army is trying to kill them and force them to vote for whoever the white candidates are? In this case, no. So the Army is going to help African Americans vote, and almost all the African Americans will vote for Grant. He is the first president who is elected without a white majority. Okay? And he just barely beats Horatio Seymour. Okay? And Horatio Seymour had the majority of white votes. Okay? So, major deal here. Okay, so Grant versus the KKK. So Grant has just fought. He captured Vicksburg. He fought throughout the South, and so chaos is happening in the South during this time. 3 men in Texas, 3 white men, are going to kill 300 former slaves. Okay, the KKK and in Tennessee and several other states had planned to harass and kill several former slaves. 4 slaves were killed in South Carolina, and 54 others were wounded, and 81 slaves were killed in Louisiana. Because of all these acts of terror committed by the Ku Klux Klan, not the Ku Klux Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, that is a tongue twister, a racist tongue twister. So anyway, the Enforcement Acts. This is passed by Congress to stop KKK activity, and Grant did it, and he was harsh. He had no problem hanging people. He had no problem executing people. He did whatever he had to dishonorably, treat his prisoners that he would catch. And if you're harsh enough on anything, you can stop anything. People aren't wearing a mask. If they did that, lined them up in the hall and hung them in front of the entire student body, people would wear a mask every day. Same thing outside this building on the streets. If they did that, everyone would wear a mask. But we don't operate that kind of police state, and that only works for so long. And that would work in the United States until they stopped being so harsh, which is exactly when the KKK started to recover. So now we look at currency. Okay? So you have a couple different theories on currency. Okay? What makes the most stable? Why do people use U.S. currency? It's because it is one of the strongest currencies in the world, and it's backed by the U.S. economy. Okay, so you have 2 different things here. You have soft money, and this is not based on the gold standards. There can always be inflation. It's easier to pay off debts because you can just print out money to pay off your debts. Now, the problem with this is the only reason that there's any value to currency is because of scarcity. Okay? So right now, how much money is in circulation as far as U.S. currency in the world? And the answer to that is $500 billion. Now, how much do we owe in national debt? About $26 trillion. Okay? So we have basically 52 times the amount of debt that we do money in circulation. So if we printed out money to pay off that debt, that would devalue our currency by 52 times, which means that if you went to go buy a gallon of gas, it would now cost you about $104 a gallon. Now, hard money, this is money that's based on the gold standard, and money will keep its value. Up until 1933, if you had a greenback, you could take it down to the Federal Reserve, and you could trade that for its value in gold. Okay? So that showed that every paper dollar that was out there in circulation had value because there was gold to back up all of the different currency. So, the crime of 73. So, Congress stops coining silver. And this really cuts down the amount of money in circulation. And the problem is, not everyone's going to have something of value, and this forces the barter system on the poor. Okay? Now, the truth is you can trade with gold and silver because both of those do have value. If you don't believe that silver has value, feel free to bring it to me, and I will throw it in the garbage for you. Okay? I will do that as, because I am kind. Now, the whiskey ring. Okay, these are government officials who filed false tax reports. Okay, basically they were taking tax on whiskey, and most of them were pocketing it. Grant said, "Once we catch them, we will punish all of them to the fullest extent of the law." And among the first people that were arrested for that was his private secretary. And it was like, I can't do that to him, so we're going to go ahead and back off of this. So it makes Grant look super corrupt. Okay? So it makes him look super corrupt. Okay? And very weak. But, it's not that he was benefiting off of any of this. It just makes him look bad that he takes this hard stance and then finds out that one of his closest associates was part of it and didn't want to do anything about it. William Belknap was the Secretary of War, and he accepted bribes to short supplies to Indian reservations. So this is whenever you have it so they're not receiving food, or all the food they're receiving is rotten. And this is really what's going to lead to some of the protests by Native American groups or them leaving reservations, which leads to basically massacres by the U.S. Army. Okay, so William Belknap was the guy who basically made sure they didn't have enough food. Robber barons. These are railroad owners that many people thought got wealthy off of society but gave nothing back. They formed pools where they would, with other railroad owners, make sure that the price of shipping things, the price of transportation, was at a fixed rate and guaranteed all of them profits. Okay, or they would buy out their competitors and get rid of competition. Pools and competitions both would basically make it harder for anyone to find a cheaper way to either travel or sell their goods. Okay, you can see right there in the pictures in the top and the bottom that the robber barons are all shown as big, heavy men, and basically being fat to most countries of the world is a sign that you are very wealthy. I spent some time in Nicaragua working in an orphanage, and all the kids thought I was rich because I'm overweight. It just turns out I have horrible eating habits, and I was a single man who ate fast food all the time, which is not very good for you. Okay, Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, they worked with Ulysses S. Grant, the President of the United States, brother-in-law, and they tried to corner the gold market by artificially raising prices. They wanted to own the majority or all of the gold in the United States, and then basically this would give them the power and resources to do whatever they wanted to do in the United States. Okay, so the Federal Reserve, though, sold gold to end their attempt to corner the gold market. Gold was someone who stole a lot of money and took advantage of people. As the owner of the railroad, he would sometimes announce that he was about to have a merger with another major railroad, which would make stock prices go through the roof. And he would do that to make a lot of money, sell his stock, and once it got up to a certain amount, he would then sell and then buy back his stock at a lower price once the market corrected itself. There will be a lot of laws that are put in place because of people like Jay Gould. And if you look at the bottom left-hand side, you see all the people holding up the robber barons and everything that they own. You see things like linens, lumber, paper, ore, all of those things. Basically, the rich got rich off of those, and the poor basically are going to lose over and over from generation to generation. So, looking at one of the biggest scandals in U.S. history to date is this one here. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad was done by Union Pacific and Central Pacific. Union Pacific, though, found a way to commit fraud, though, in a way that fraud had not been committed before. What they did is they created a construction company called Credit Mobilier, and they created it to build the railroad for them, to lay down the tracks, okay? And you can legally do this. I had a rental property for years, which is considered a business, okay? And so I could hire someone to do work and pay them, and then I could deduct that from my taxes, or I could hire myself to do the work and pay myself and deduct the taxes from that. Now, the truth is there's no money really exchanging hands whenever I pay myself, but what I am doing is saving myself money from having to pay someone else. Okay, and so I can charge myself, but I have to charge myself something reasonable. Union Pacific or Credit Mobilier overcharged themselves. Okay, and they actually took the money out of the company and put the money into their pockets. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the government was so desperate to get a Transcontinental Railroad built that they gave additional land grants in exchange for stock in Union Pacific. And Congress did that, so basically they took bribes to give Credit Mobilier more land grants. And so several members of Congress are going to be implicated in the scandal, but and one of those is actually the vice president as well. So this is one of the first major scandals in the U.S., and it's one that's really understood because it's a little bit complicated how they did it, but well, that's one way to do it. Okay, the political machine. Okay, now this is something that really is not much different from the spoil system. Okay, but these are people that ran cities, and they did it in a kind of corrupt way. Now, they provide very important city services and jobs for votes. So if you vote for me, I'll give you a job. But if you don't vote for me, I'll make sure you don't have a job, and also make sure that maybe you don't have sewer services in your part of the town, or well, anyway. So things like that. You might not have electricity or gas piped to your part of the city. They might accidentally have a problem where it's cut off from you. Okay, and it was so corrupt in places like New York that 1 out of every 12 men in New York worked for the city government. Now, the Tweed Ring. This is led by William Boss Tweed. They controlled the New York political machine, which was called Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall is not a person, but it is the political machine in New York run by Boss Tweed. And he stole $200 million from New York citizens. Okay? I don't know if you understand just how much $200 million is, but if you had it stacked in $100 bills where the bills are stacked right on top of each other, you're looking at an area that's probably about 12 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and about 6 to 8 feet tall, and $100 bills stacked like that. Eventually, he's going to try and sneak off with all that money because he finds out that the jig is up, but he gets arrested and he gets prosecuted by Samuel Tilden, who will use that to run for president in 1876. And, well, he'll die in jail. William Boss Tweed will. But you can see him portrayed on the left-hand side. Very wealthy, very fat. Again, being fat was a sign of being rich. So that takes us to the end of today. If you were paying attention, I guess the only positive thing that happened was the railroad was built. Other than that, you have a bunch of horrible things being done to Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, to Irish immigrants, African Americans in the South, the poor of the nation, and Native Americans, and even the people that were getting land in center parts of the United States was done mainly to keep the claim on that land, so that's not even a positive either. So let's just hope this unit gets better from here. Don't cocaine, don't AIDS, and if you see anyone coveting, tell them to stop.